The best mask one can wear is no mask at all. It's as if your mask appears to be your normal face. It's even more interesting when your face is so outlandish that no one takes your face seriously. And then when others find out that you are wearing a mask, you play it off as a joke because you have a very funny personality. With that being said, what if Emporio Ivankov is the supreme leader of Cypherpole Asia Zero? What if Emporio Ivankov is the Grand Master of the Six Powers, a caliber higher than Rob, Lucy, or Who's Who? With that being said, let me explain. So big shout out to KMDP, a moderator on my Discord, The Digital Burrow, because it is through conversations with him that I started to come to this conclusion. Now, when discussing the six powers, it has been explained to us that there's a bit of a learning curve that's not really available to everyone when it comes to this particular Kenpo. As Nero, during his fight with Frankie in the pre-time skip, tells us that he cannot use Finger Pistol. And then when he performs Tempest Kick, he only has one variation of Tempest Kick. This is way weaker than various other experienced characters that we've seen throughout the series, such as members of CP9 who are now part of CP Agent Zero, and characters who were once a Cypherpole agent like Who's Who, but who have been touted as having a great amount of understanding of the six powers. Now, when you get into pirates who accidentally pick up the six powers, or various other characters who simply pick up the six powers, it always floats around two. Those being Moonwalk and Shave, or Sorrow and Geppo. Because we see Luffy do it in various forms. Gear 2nd is just Shave. Gear 4th has Moonwalk. And Gear 4 Snake Man has Razor, which is a combination of Moonwalk and Shave together. We've also seen Lucy use Moonwalk and Shave together to move in a zigzag pattern, as if he is flying. And then, of course, we have Sanji and his various variations of Moonwalk called Skywalk and Blue Walk. One a simple flying technique, the other a way to move through water faster. So we've seen these things before. However, seeing as how other techniques are not performed by these characters, it's very apparent that you need special training in order to perform things such as Finger Pistol and Tempest Kick. With that being said, it's also very interesting that projectile techniques such as air cannons are always touted in very high regard, or seen as something that it takes a lot of precision and strength in order for a person to perform said technique. For example, Zoro goes through an entire mini arc during the events of Skypiea to perfect and strengthen his flying sword technique. And from that point forward, projectile attacks through the use of super strength have always been a very cultivated and precious sort of thing. Even when you start to talk about the six powers, this remains true based on the explanation I just gave. And when you start to talk about more advanced techniques of those two variations. For example, there is a flying finger pistol done by no other than Lucy. Lucy, who canonically is the only true master of the six powers. On top of that, he has variations of Tempest Kick as well that are more powerful than the base Tempest Kick. So I say that to say, even from early as Skypiea, flying projectile attacks that use super strength are treated with very precious regard. With that being said, let's turn things back to Ivankov. Deathwing might just be the most impressive and the most powerful display of a fighting style in the entirety of One Piece. Why do I say that? Well, during chapter 537, when Ivankov first shows up, he is able to repel an incoming cannonball via winking. The air pressure generated by him winking is powerful enough to stop a cannonball mid-trajectory and reverse it back on the shooter. There has never been a One Piece character in the entirety of the series who is able to exert that much power through an action that takes so little effort, which, through the way the technique is performed, doesn't it remind you of something? Doesn't it give an air of something we've seen beforehand? I'm suggesting that Deathwing is Finger Pistol. But you see, what's interesting about this is that, taking things back to the Six Powers, when you look at the Six Powers and you look at characters who are adept at using the fighting style stops being a rule book of things you need to do in a particular way, and the techniques start to become brushes of which the character can paint their own canvas of war on. The sense of expression comes out through the mastery of the fighting style. We've seen this very, very well through characters such as Kaku and Lucian, Who's Who, in which the rules of what is and is not don't matter anymore. For example, Kaku has an attack called Nose Gun, using the ability that he has gained in the Ox Fruit model giraffe. He is now a square giraffe and can shoot his head out like a rifle. So his technique, his application of Finger Pistol, is now just as valid as any other variation of Finger Pistol, but is specialized to him because it is a technique that he devised based on the unique situation that he is in. So why can't we say this for Ivankov's Deathwing? Why can't Ivankov be a drunken master of the Six Powers of sorts? Someone who uses their unconventional style of dress and unconventional way of doing things to throw off the opponent while delivering devastating blows that the opponent would not expect. This is why I'm starting to think that these funny antics, these goofball jokes that Ivankov does, have a way deeper meaning to them than one would think initially. It's even more interesting when you consider that it can do things such as blow up one of Magellan's Hydras with ease. So the proficiency of him simply winking is so powerful that he can destabilize a devil fruit construct with ease without even touching it. This leads me to think that there is more to Ivankov than meets the eye. So with that being said, let's talk about the hormone fruit for a second. Don't you find it interesting or peculiar that in having the hormone fruit, Ivankov is very, very good at stabbing people with his needle fingers? Doesn't that remind you of anything? Especially seeing as how he is so quick to do so. So much so that when the power is first shown off in chapter 537, Bella doesn't even know what happened. It reminds me of the six power technique known as Shigan, or Finger Pistol once again. Just saying that it's very peculiar that both of these things are shown together upon Ivankov's debut in the manga. Now, with that being said, it's very rare that you find a paramecia user of any kind who has a fighting style that meshes with their devil fruit. Many, many, many times it is treated as one a separate moveset from their fighting style, or two, simply how they fight. For example, would say Whitebeard. Whitebeard doesn't have a fighting style. His fighting style is hitting you with an earthquake bubble. That's what his fighting style is. And we see a very interesting division of this when you get into characters like, say, Kinemon, or more specifically, Betham, Mr. 2, or Bon Clay. So when you get to Mr. 2, he specifically cannot use Okama Kenpo outside of his main body. Because, of course, he is the user of the Paramecia type Devil Fruit known as the Clone Fruit. And in being the user of the Clone Fruit, he can copy the bodies of other people by touching their face with his hand. And then by touching his own face, he can then transform into them. However, during his fight with Sanji, we see that his fighting style, known as Okama Kenpo, is tailor-made for his specific proportions. Therefore, when he becomes anyone else, he cannot fight properly and has to transform back into himself in order to actually fight. It is also very peculiar that, based on how things are laid out, there is a distinct separation from what is being called New Kama Kenpo and what Betham calls Okama Kenpo. Because based on how Betham talks about Okama Kenpo, it seems as though he created the fighting style himself, as he doesn't mention a teacher, nor is Ivankov credited as a teacher when they meet each other in Impel Down. Therefore, I'm going off of that to say that this is something that he just devised himself. What's furthermore interesting about this is that there are principles presented in Okama Kenpo that would then translate into more specialized superhuman fighting styles later on in the series, such as the Six Powers and then New Kama Kenpo, because it's very interesting that to make up for his lack of range, he implements projectile equipment, such as his swan heads, of which he puts on his shoes, and then says because of how the beaks are made and how he kicks, there's so much pressure focused into a point, it can replicate that of a rifle shot. And then, of course, he has the mascara technique, in which he tears the mascara from his eyes and uses those as boomerangs. But the funny thing about this is that after Alabasta, we find that people can do projectile techniques just based off of their own strength, like Zoro, like users of the Six Powers, and Ivankov. So with that being said, Okama Kenpo is a fighting style developed by Betham to use with his body proportions, and then for the strength that he lacks, he uses equipment for to shore up his weaknesses. Whereas New Kama Kenpo is a variation of the Six Powers developed by Ivankov based on his proficiency in using the Six Powers. Now, another point of how Ivankov is better than the majority of Paramecia users in the series, we have to see what has happened to Bluto and Califa, obviously, after the time skip. But just based off of first showings, Ivankov is in a very unique position, because based on the powers of his Devil Fruit, much like Betham, if he trained these various forms that he has, but based off of what his Devil Fruit does, he can combine his fighting style with the powers of his Devil Fruit, because they only enhance what he naturally does, which is very reminiscent of how Zoan users in the CP9 and then Who's Who of the Beast Pirates fight. Because what happens when they turn into their Zoan states, all their six power techniques get amplified. The same thing happens with Ivankov, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens with him, and roughly only him, because no other Paramecia has a separate fighting style that then doubles back into their devil fruit. It's always as if the devil fruit and how they fight are synonymous with one another. There's no actual separation. But here it's very deliberate that we have Deathlink, which is what Ivankov uses without any modifiers, and then via the use of his devil fruit while using face growth hormones, he can turn the simple Deathlink into a Hellwink, which is a way, way bigger variant of Deathlink to cause even more damage on a grand scale. And then, of course, there's Galaxy Wink, which shows you that he even has variations on the Death Wink. So, with that being said, it really does make me believe that he is no different than the various other 6-power Zoan fruit users that we've seen throughout the story, because his Paramecia fruit enables him to increase aspects of his own body, much like a Zoan fruit user would. So in the spirit of talking about Betham, let's talk about his opponent Sanji, because it's very interesting that during the course of the 2-year time skip, 8 of the 9 Straw Hats go to places and gain various teachers who then improve their abilities and give them new ones. The only Straw Hat who does not gain a teacher is Brook, because the time skip for him was more so about developing himself and awakening the depths of his revive fruit powers, right? But going down the list, Frankie goes to Vegapunk's home island and discovers his blueprints. Therefore, in a way, Vegapunk was Frankie's teacher. Robin gets to go to Tequila Wolf, which is very dark, but is then picked up by the Revolutionary Army and is trained by Koala and Sabo, both in the ways of Fishman Karate and Dragon Claw Fist. Following that, we have Chopper, who goes to the Birdie Kingdom and studies within the library of said kingdom. He then comes back with Kung Fu Point, which is very reminiscent of the human inhabitants of the Birdie Kingdom. Following Chopper leads us to Usopp. Usopp, of course, goes to the Boeing Archipelago and discovers what pop greens are from Heracles. Then, following him, we have Nami. Nami goes to Witheria and studies under Harides and the various other wizardly old men of Witheria. Following that, we have Zoro, who goes to the Muggy Kingdom and studies under Mihawk, doing a pretty bang-up impression of Mihawk upon his return to Sabaody Archipelago, as much like Mihawk's introduction, he too cuts a giant ship in half. But to continue. And then we have Luffy, who learns hockey under Rayleigh. Now, swinging back to Sanji, of course, he goes to Kamabakka Queendom. It is very funny that in Kamabakka Queendom, he develops the use of one of the 6 powers, seemingly all on his own, in being Moonwalk, which he later then develops into Skywalk and Blue Walk. Isn't it interesting that even though Ivankov does not teach him one of the 6 powers, he just so happens to develop one of them during his time on Ivankov's home island, or the territory that he has proclaimed to be his queendom, his home. I don't think that was done on accident. I think that was a very interesting yet subtle masterstroke by Oda to illustrate that Nukama Kenpo comes from the 6 powers, because following that, Sanji then has to fight 99 masters of New Kama Kenpo in order to gain their various recipes, which in itself is very interesting, because I don't think many people think about what that necessarily means for Kamabakka Queendom as a place. Because what that means is that Kamabakka Queendom is a private military state run by Ivankov. Just saying. And it's also quite interesting that in having 100 people, including Ivankov himself, who know this fighting style, it means that if my assumptions are correct, he has trained nearly 100 people to use these 6 powers in his way of fighting. So he has a private militia of nearly 100 people whom he has trained very expertly to a point in which they all can do what he can do more or less. This is an alarming development when you consider that not even Big Mom has an army that large. Not really, because Big Mom only has 85 children of varying strength, and some of them are helped out via the use of various Delphi powers. But to have 99 people who are extremely proficient in a fighting style is pretty rare in the world of One Piece. No one is quite that developed. You can argue Amazon Lily perhaps, but to get a exact number is quite interesting, especially seeing as how Sanji has now fought all these people. And then there's the matter of who exactly taught Sanji hockey during all of this. Because Ivankov, even though it is said or suggested that he knows about hockey, he never actually performs any hockey techniques himself. He never coats his hand in hockey. Now, mind you, he is a pre-time skip character, so perhaps that's being saved for another venture. But it would be very odd if he didn't know hockey, given where the story is going now, and seeing as how he seems to be, based on what we know about him, a very big wig in the Revolutionary Army. So going back to the topic of masks, it's very interesting that the higher ranked members of Cypher Po Aegis Zero wear masks to show their rank, right? So with that being said, if you don't know, Ivankov has this very interesting gag, and we first see it in chapter 545, in which he is fighting Magellan, and Magellan hits him with a Venom Hydra. It appears as though it's burning his face. However, this is used for a gag as he pulls off a layer of makeup that ends up looking like a mask. Now, given the size of his face and the size of his head, which we know are natural for him, it bears very interesting resemblance to the masks of Cypher Po Aegis Zero, just in how big and weird it appears to be, given that his face is big and weird. Now, what's furthermore interesting about this is that it's a perfect disguise when you think about it, because if you know Ivankov and you've seen him all the time, the application of heavy makeup would just be commonplace for him. But it's very reminiscent of Cypher Po Aegis Zero because he indeed is wearing a mask. We get some more interesting implication of this not necessarily being normal makeup either, thanks to Stussy. Because in chapter 1072 and 1073, Stussy manages to incapacitate both Rob Lucci and Kaku via the use of her Sea Prism Stone lipstick. Now, as of this recording, we don't know what kind of doll fruit that she has, but apparently, despite being a doll fruit user, she is able to wear this makeup, use her powers, and affect other doll fruit users, as she simply bites Kaku, which incapacitates him, but for Lucci, she needs a little more. So not only does she stab Lucci with the stick of the Sea Prism Stone lipstick, but she also bites him as well. This leads me to believe that Ivankov is using the same thing to a much greater extreme. Perhaps he is covering his entire face with the same makeup composition that the lipstick is made out of, creating a defensive mask that he can use in situations like in which he is fighting Magellan. The reason why the mask does not melt straight away is because it has an innate resistance to devil fruit powers, as it is made in part with C prism stone. So, not only is this mask being used to assert his rank, presumably as the head of CP0, but it's also used as a defensive measure to catch his opponents off guard as they think they are attacking his face, but they are actually attacking the C Prism Stone mask of makeup that he is wearing. On the topic of setting people off kilter, something very interesting is brought up in the SBS Volume 53. Oda states that there is a joke eighth power of the six powers called Cho Kai, which translates to bother. So perhaps this joke is not actually a joke and is what Ivankov is actually using all the time, as Ivankov is in part a performer. And the funny part about performer themed characters is that there's always more to them than meets the eye. For example, Betham is a type of performer, literally and figuratively, as he is dressed as a ballerina, someone who performs dance in front of a large audience, and he performs the roles of several characters throughout the Alabasta arc, such as King Cobra and Nami. Following him, we have Kumadori, who's always had a sort of stage show persona throughout the entirety of Enies Lobby, and he is a six powers user. Then, too, we have another fellow six powers user in Who's Who is one who has the title of Toby Ropo, and a Toby Ropo is just one of the strongest headliners in Kaido's organization. A headliner is someone whose name is printed at the top of the list of performers. So in this way, being a Toby Ropo just means you're the most important headliner of the headliners. And a headliner is someone who performs at a play or at a concert or at some sort of festival. So in having that title, Who's Who is a performer. He has a performer theme. And the reason why I bring him up specifically is that he is one of two performers that is more than what he seems, because he, like X Drake, was a part of the world government at some point, because he is a former Cypher Pole agent. And he is the one, of course, who tells us about Nika. So of the Toby Ropo who have a more in-depth backstory, I would take his over someone like X Drake's, because it is Who's who's given the lofty title of being a prodigy that rivals Rob Lucci, which puts him in very interesting company. And X Drake doesn't get that sort of treatment, so I don't see him as important as Who's Who. But moving on, following that, talking about other members of Kaido's organization, we have Konjuro, who is a part of the Kurozumi family, and his particular sect of the Kurozumi family were stage performers, and he takes that persona to heart as he acted as friend towards Odin and the rest of the Nine Scabbards until it was his time to reveal himself and strike, declaring his loyalty to Orochi and the Kurozumi clan. With that being said, performer-themed characters always have something interesting going on, whether that is a joke, a backstory, or they are two-faced and actually have a different agenda. This brings us back to Ivankov. Ivankov is dressed as a burlesque dancer, and the first time that we see Ivankov, he is performing on a stage as if he is doing some sort of show. With that being said, it's very interesting too that when you look at Kuma's flashback, he always has had the gift of a silver tongue, as he portrays himself as a leader, as someone who knows what the plan is, as he somehow organizes a plot along with Guinea in order to steal the two devil fruits known as the Paw fruit and the fish fruit model Azure Dragon. But going off of that, the funny thing about him is that when Kuma sends himself, Ivankov, and Guinea back to his home of the Sorbet Kingdom, Ivankov makes a way for a ship and departs shortly after. We don't know what actually happens to him between that time and the time Ivankov and Dragon show up to save an adult Kuma and an adult Guinea. So that leaves a lot of room for very interesting development to happen. With that being said, isn't it funny that back when we were introduced to the CP9, Cypherpole 9, we were introduced to a director, that being Spandam. Despite having so many Cypherpole Aegis Zero members out and about, we've never been introduced to a director. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, I do think Emporio Ivankov will be revealed to be the director of Cypherpole Aegis Zero. But to continue, also, isn't it peculiar that of all the characters that could have told us the full family name of Emu, it was Ivankov? Don't you find that interesting? I propose, like I proposed earlier in that Evil Ivankov video, I think there is a very nefarious purpose in how the Revolutionary Army are now in the territory of Ivankov. I don't think this was a mistake. I think this was orchestrated because maybe, just maybe, there is a plan between Ivankov himself and Blackbeard to get the Revolutionary Army out of the way for some sort of purpose. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Watson.